Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Krisman, and I serve as the College Conference of Illinois and Wisconsin's Assistant Executive Director. As the CCIW kicks off NCAA Division III week, we are thrilled to introduce Adria Terry of AT Inclusion Consulting and her topic, Intent versus Impact, an Introduction to Microaggressions. Adria earned her Master of Education in Higher Education Administration from Louisiana State and holds a Bachelor of Science in Community Leadership and Development from the University of Kentucky. Currently, Adria works for a commercial real estate firm as a diversity and inclusion coordinator. Prior to her current role, she spent 3 years at the University of Houston as program manager for the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. In this role, she empowered the University of Houston community to learn about diversity, celebrate differences, and foster inclusive environments through interactive diversity workshops, programmatic support, and campus collaboration. Here, she found her talent and passion for facilitating workshops and delivering thought-provoking D&I topics to students, faculty, and staff. In 2019, Adria started her own consulting business. Her work focuses on delivering diversity workshops, small and large group facilitation, one-on-one intercultural development inventory coaching sessions, and instructional design. She's a certified intercultural development inventory qualified administrator and enjoys meeting individuals where they are and developing their understanding of self and others. Adria will spend the first part of tonight's presentation giving the audience a better understanding of microaggressions. We'll spend the last 15 minutes taking questions from the audience. If you have a question during that time, please be sure to include it in the chat function. Well, without further ado, I want to turn it over to Adria to start tonight's presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I am elated to be here. And Mike, please, when I don't have like a timer in front of me, so when I get to kind of my 40-ish minute mark, if you could pop on and just kind of tell me that I'm on about time, that'll help me keep time a little bit better. But thank you all for having me so much and for the introduction. Again, this is Intent versus Impact. It's an intro to microaggressions. So I really hope that we can have an interactive conversation about what microaggressions are, how they show up, how they impact certain communities, and even what it looks like to have a microaggression placed on you, or if you have accidentally and unintentionally committed a microaggression, what that looks like, and how we can move through to create just more an inclusive environment with being a little bit more aware of microaggressions and how we unintentionally can commit them. So thank you all for being here today. Hopefully it's a very engaging 45 minutes. So let's go ahead and get started. Some workshop agreements today, of course, respect. So I understand that looks a little bit different for everyone. So we're just going to make sure that when we are having dialogue in our chat feature that we're keeping it respectful. This is a brave space and a safe space. So I want you all to feel comfortable with having this dialogue. I know D&I conversations and talking about diversity and what inclusion looks like cannot people sometimes don't speak out because I don't know what to say, right? But I want to assure you that this is a space where I hope we feel brave enough to just kind of have that dialogue in its full totality. Challenge yourself to keep an open mind. So we won't leave from this presentation being experts, right? Or you won't leave here knowing everything about microaggressions, but challenge yourself to take something away from the presentation. And it's okay to feel uncomfortable. So again, a lot of us aren't having diversity and inclusion conversations regularly, or if we do, we may be new to this space, but if you feel uncomfortable or something is said that makes you think a little bit, it's okay to feel challenged and uncomfortable. A lot of times I like to think that that's where the learning happens, is when we're feeling uncomfortable because we're being stretched, right? So it's okay to sit in that and to have dialogue with me and your peers about those feelings. And then lastly, please engage. We will be using the chat feature a lot. I will be calling you on you all a lot to engage with me in the chat. It'll be a pretty boring 45 minutes if I'm just doing all the talking. I want you all to be able to have some dialogue with me as well. And then, so we'll start by kind of exploring some social and cultural identities and their significance in talking about microaggressions. I'll introduce you all to 3 different forms of microaggressions, and then we'll increase your awareness of how actions and words can impact people in ways unintended. That's that intent versus the impact piece. And then we're going to identify some tools to respond to microaggressions. So when they come up, what do we do from there? So microaggressions are death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And I know that sounds super dramatic. People on here are like, okay, Adria, what are you talking about? Death by 1,000,000 paper cuts. But I got this line from a YouTube video that I watched on microaggressions, and someone, the person that was explaining my microaggressions explained it in this way. And it made a lot of sense to me because oftentimes they are really unintentional acts that we don't think about all the time. And the person that is receiving the microaggression oftentimes can receive one after the other, after the other, after the other, right? Called the Pylon Principle, something we'll talk about a little bit later. But that principle essentially is death by 1,000,000 paper cuts because it's those very subtle things that are said that we don't even understand is really happening, right? And just to give you all a quick synopsis of what this is, I have a video that I'll share really quickly. Let me pull up a video here just so we have an understanding of what they are. Hold on just a second. Sorry about this. Okay. Well, I cannot for some reason get to my, Okay, well, maybe we won't share the video. Technical difficulties, it looks like. That's fine. We're going to just keep it moving. So what are microaggressions, right? Really quickly, and before I give you all the definition of what exactly they are, let's go in the chat really quickly. Have you all heard of microaggressions? Just take a stab at what do we think they are? Talk to me really quickly. What do we think microaggressions are? There's no right or wrong answer. Let's see, what are we thinking? Okay, we have one person here. Thank you, Mike. They are unintentional, yes. Anyone else? What do we think they are? Oh, you guys are gonna make me talk to myself today? Small challenges, yes, Elise, okay. Unintentional quips or digs at someone, something like a backhanded compliment, yes, Sarah, absolutely, thank you. Yeah, you all are both right. So when we talk about microaggressions, we're talking about the verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages based upon people's marginalized group. You might be thinking, well, Adria, what's a marginalized group? And we're going to get into that a little bit just because I want you all to have a good understanding of what a marginalized identity means. But the action can be intentional or unintentional. And a lot of people think microaggressions this term just came about, and it didn't. In fact, in the 1970s, it was first proposed by a psychiatrist. So it's been around for a long time. This research has been developing for a while. I also see in the chat that microaggressions are sarcasm and can be judging someone on their culture, and both of those are correct as well. So perpetrators of microaggressions are often unaware that they engage in such communication. And I really want you all to hold on to that, right? Because whether you're the person receiving a microaggression or you have said the microaggression, a lot of times they are unintentional, right? And so for a lot of us on either side, we have to start using these moments as learning, as a teachable and learning moments, because a lot of times the people who have done or committed the microaggression, they didn't even know that it happened, very well-meaning, right? And microaggressions also range across all social identities. So at first, when the research about microaggressions first came about, it was really focused on race-based microaggressions and what that looks like. But now we have spanned away from race, well, not away from it, but across all identities to talk more about microaggressions in all forms. And we'll go over that a little bit. But again, intention does not always equal impact, right? So when we do commit a microaggression and we're like, oh my gosh, I never meant to say that, or I never meant to offend you, that we're still responsible for the impact that our microaggression had on someone else, right? And that is one of the key takeaways for today. I told you that we were going to talk a little bit about our social identities and figuring out, well, how does microaggressions play into social identities, or why should we be aware of the social identities of other people? So in the chat really quickly, this is Jim Parsons. I'm not sure, I might be aging myself a little bit, the Big Bang Theory, but if you all have seen the show, let's just in the chat really quick, what are some of Jim's visible identities? When we see Jim, what do we see? What do we see about him? He's a brainiac. He's skinny. Yes. Nerd, white, skinny, male. Yes. We might not know if he's a nerd, but just by looking at him. But yes. Okay, what else? So we have a white, slim male who may be smart and nerdy. What else? Oh, Brittany. Okay, his style may not be the best. All right. He's a know-it-all. Okay. Yeah, Brittany, I don't really like his shoes either. So I'm with you on that one. Someone else, what do we notice about Jim? About Jim? Anything? All right. So some of his visible identities that we can recognize, right? His gender expression, we assume that he's a male, right? He has short hair. We assume, based on how he's clothed, we think he's a male, he's a man. His race or his skin color, we say he's white. We see he's not in a wheelchair of any sort, so we assume that he's an able-bodied person. I would say he's middle-aged, right? And that we pointed out his body size and type as well as him being pretty slim and fit. So what about if Jim were this iceberg that's to the right, we just named everything that's above the waterline, things that we can see, right? What are some of his identities that may be under the waterline? What are things about Jim that we might not know? What are some of Jim's identities that we might have no idea about just from seeing him or having maybe one interaction with him? And you can also think about yourself, right? We don't know his identity as maybe a father or a husband, or does he have family? That's true. We don't know his sexual orientation, his marital status, his mental health. Come on, Lindsay. Yes. What else? What else do we not know about Jim? We have no idea what his personality is. Is he an extrovert? Is he an introvert? How he was raised and what he believes in? Absolutely. These are things about Jim just on meeting him that we have no idea, right? So his gender identity, we don't know his ethnicity, his culture, we don't know what he does for a living, we don't know his marital status, we don't know his abilities, his mental or physical abilities, we don't know his values, his education level, his religion, his socioeconomic status. We have no idea of all of these things, right? And I show you this because how many people, or think about your teammates, think about people or your classmates and your teammates that you interact with on a daily basis. How many of us actually think about people we interact with like this iceberg, right? Do we think about all of their identities? Do we think about their background, how they were raised, their values, right? Or sometimes are we making preconceived notions and judgments based on that top 25% that we see that's above the waterline, right? And you might be thinking, well, Adria, what does this have to do with microaggressions? Like, how do these two relate? And I say this because I want to encourage you all to get to know the people around you, not only above the waterline, but get to know the things that are under the surface, right? Now, oftentimes when microaggressions are committed, they're hurtful for others also because we didn't know some of the underlying identities, right? So for instance, I have a cousin who is autistic, right? So when I hear people say, oh my gosh, that's so retarded, right? And very well meaning, they're probably saying it as a joke. It's just like, oh, that's retarded, right? They're trying to say that's silly, or that's what, like that's it's just used as a slang, right? But for me, it really hits home because I have an autistic family member, right? But when people don't know these things about you or your family or your values, or we don't consider these things about other people, it's easy for things like that, like, oh, that's so retarded or that's so dumb, to roll right off of our tongues without thinking, right? So I would encourage you all, just as this exercise, because I know that we don't think about people in this way, and I know that we don't always take the extra mile to get to know the values and beliefs of other people, but I would encourage each of you, even if it's just one teammate or two teammates or people that you interact with closely, try to get to know not only the things above the waterline, but the things under the waterline. And I want to bring this back also. The things that are above the waterline are the things that we tend to make judgments on the quickest, right? Our brains are inherently biased. We all have bias. I would love to say that we don't. As much unconscious bias training that I do for other people, I would love to say that we could get rid of bias. But unfortunately, our brains were wired to inherently have bias, right? And so, and it's for a good reason. Our brains do this because we have to make these fast judgments on times that we come in contact with real danger, right? The problem with that is that the associations our brains make are based on patterns of exposure over time. So the things that we have been exposed to, whether that be through our family, right, the media, or real personal interactions, our brains have started to make these associations. So for example, if I know Mike, right? Mike invited me to come here and to do this training with you all. But if I have had limited exposure, right, to Mike or to other white males such as Mike, then my brain is going to start making associations to Mike based on what my family has said, based on what I have heard through the media, and based on my limited contact, right? So we have to keep these things in mind when we start thinking about the associations our brains make about the identities that are above the waterline, right? I'm sorry. And so when we don't have personal exposure, the media that we consume plays a role in forming those associations in our brain, right? And I'm guilty of this through my housewife shows and my all my like little reality TV that I indulge in. I start to make these, and we all do, we start making these assumptions. Well, really wealthy people must act in this way, right? Because on TV, I see these really wealthy women and they're out in Beverly Hills and they're shopping, and they have their Rolls Royces and they're doing all these fancy things. And so in my mind, that has become the single story narrative that I have painted about wealthy people, right? Based on the media that I consume. If we go back to the murder of George Floyd, all the rioting that was happening, and the narrative that about the police officers, the narrative about George Floyd, the narrative about people who were protesting, we started consuming all these different forms of media, and based on our own identities and our exposure to these groups, we started then making assumptions and forming associations in our brains, right? Because our brains do that inherently, right? If you all are still with me, give a thumbs up in the chat or let me know that you're still here, that we're engaged, we're all on the same page, right? So unfortunately, the media we consumed, again, is riddled with stereotypes, inaccuracies, generalizations, and misinformation, right? And so that's why I also have you on the side here, like the angry Black woman stereotype. When I watch Atlanta Housewives, that's all I see are angry Black women arguing with each other, right? And if I were a person that had no other, if I didn't have any association, or if I wasn't a Black person myself and in the Black community, I would not know that all Black women do not behave in that way, right? Based on media. Or I have this other child here, because a lot of times There's a stereotype even about young Asian children and what that looks like, and them being very smart. I have a really close Asian friend who has said, you know, that stereotype has really, really hurt me throughout my life, right? It's a microaggression that she, being smart and being in the Asian community, has experienced a lot of, but it has caused her to have a lot of anxiety and stress and being an overachiever because she feels like she has to live up to this very unrealistic stereotype. So keep that in mind too, that with the media we consume, that's where our stereotypes and inaccuracies and generalizations start coming from. And from there, microaggressions are committed, right? I'm going to bring it full circle back to microaggressions. I promise I didn't lose us here, right? So there are three forms of microaggressions. There's micro assault, and this is our very, I don't even know why they call it micro. It should be called macro, because this is our overt racism. This is Confederate flags. This is swastikas. This is our very overt, in your face, kind of blatant discrimination, right? Then we have micro insults. A micro insult is you see a Black male walking on campus and you're like, hey man, what sport do you play? Because you automatically feel like because he was admitted onto your college campus and he may be a large, fit looking Black man, he has to be there, not based on his academic ability, but maybe because he plays a sport, right? That is a micro insult, right? And then we have micro invalidations, where let's say Lindsay, I don't know your major, but I'm just going to say you're an engineer. And in Lindsay, I consistently address Lindsay in emails as Mr. Keller, because there's no way that Lindsay could be my top engineering student. That is a micro invalidation, right? So there are three different forms of microaggressions, and the most common are micro insults and micro invalidations. A lot of time the micro assaults are the ones that people are like, I know this isn't right, right? Or I can feel that this is wrong. But the micro insults and invalidations are the more subconscious or unconscious. It's like, I didn't even know that I offended you, right? Oh, and of course I define them and forgot. So again, the micro assaults, so the verbal attacks, the name calling, the behavior, avoidant behavior, and purposeful discrimination. The micro insults are unconscious insults demeaning a marginalized person's heritage or identity, similar to what we just discussed. And then the micro invalidations communicate that someone is excluded, or they negate or nullify a marginalized person's thoughts, feelings, or their reality. All right. So again, microaggressions are messages that demean a person on a personal or a group level. They communicate feelings of being lesser. They suggest people do not belong to the majority group, and they can threaten or intimidate people, right? And when we talk about microaggressions, and I'm about to get into a slew of examples, because you may be saying, well, Adria, we're talking about what they are, and you haven't given us one example yet. And I promise we're going to get into a bunch of examples in just a second. But I want to really touch on this, and I'm going to need your participation in just a second. Microaggressions suggest that people do not belong with a majority group. And earlier when I defined them, they're verbal or nonverbal slights, right, that are committed against people with marginalized identities. So we're going to do a quick exercise. I don't want you all to be lost on what marginalized identities are, or what is the majority group, or who are the people who are experiencing microaggressions, right? So I want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of when we say dominant group or non-dominant group or people with marginalized identities, who exactly are we talking about? Or who is most likely to experience a microaggression? So let's think about this. And this is, I get some feedback sometimes. It's like, Adria, well, I'm in this dominant group and I don't feel dominant, or that's not my lifestyle, right? And I want you all to know that this is based on what society has built, right? So think from your societal lens. This is not Adria making this up, but think about what society says is the dominant group, right? So we're going to start with if white people, right, are the dominant group, then who would be the marginalized group? Go ahead and in the chat, who would be the marginalized group? There's no right or wrong answer. Black, Asian, Latinx, of course. So people of color, every other race, yes. If the dominant group are men, who's the marginalized group? Yes, Paul, brown people. Sarah, yes, women. And I'm gonna say women or transgender people, right? Transgender people are also a marginalized identity. Good job, y'all. If the dominant group in the US society are Christians, who's the marginalized group? Non-Christians, absolutely. Jewish people too, yes, yes, Paul. If the dominant group are heterosexual cisgendered people, when I say cisgendered, that means how you identify in your mind is the same sex that you were assigned at birth. So what's in your brain and how you feel about yourself matches with what's between your legs, your anatomy. That's a cisgendered person, right? Heterosexual cisgender. Yep, Lindsay, LGBTQIA+, trans people, yes. The LGBTQ community, yes, or transgender people. And this makes me feel some type of way, but middle-aged people, if we are the dominant group, who is the marginalized group? Yep, older, younger, or younger or very old, yes. And then middle to upper class is the dominant group. So yes, poor to working class people, absolutely. And I wanted to, again, to make sure that we put this up here because, and let me make sure there's not one more. Yes, there is. Able-bodied people. Yes, Paul, lower socioeconomic, yep. That is the correct term. Yes, and you know what? I see disabled people. I wanna challenge you all to put the person first, right? So people with disabilities, right? People with disabilities, absolutely. And so I want to put this up here because some of you all could identify with maybe some identities on the dominant side, and you may also have some marginalized identities at the same time. Right? So I have some identities in both groups. So based on this, I could be suffering or be having microaggressions committed upon me because of some of my marginalized identities, right? So this is a very good point that, you know, the more dominant identities that you have, of course, I guess the more privilege you have in terms of society, right? But I want to make a point that if you have any identities that fall on the marginalized side, you can have a microaggression committed against you, against one of your identities. Okay? So some examples, right? This was a study done at Boston College, and then from Boston College, it went kind of viral, and people started plastering microaggressions that had been committed against them everywhere, right? It became this humongous thing. But here on the far left, so you're Chinese, right? And this is to an Asian person who we have no idea what part of Asia she's actually from, right? But to say, hey, so you're Chinese, right? Is a microaggression. The person who said that probably just wanted to know her background, wanted to get to know her a little more. But coming right out the gate and saying that could be microaggressive behavior. In the middle, when people think it's weird that I listen to Carrie Underwood, right? Why would someone think that it's weird that she is listening to Carrie Underwood? Because Carrie Underwood is a country artist that we typically do not associate with Black culture, right? But recognizing, going back to our earlier statements, our brains have made associations of what we think that certain communities should do or how they should indulge music, media, whatever. So when we see a Black girl who may be listening to Carrie Underwood, we're like, wait a second, right? And then Courtney, I don't see you as a Black girl, right? Courtney may be different than what this person who said that to her perceives Black people to be, right? But that is absolutely microaggressive behavior. This one on the far left. So like, what are you? And in the chat really quickly, when someone says, well, what are you? What are they asking? What are they asking him? What do they want to know? Probably his race. Maybe his sexuality. Yeah. That's one that I hadn't considered. But I know a lot of times, and sometimes when I bring this up, people are like, do people really ask that question? And I'm here to say, absolutely. You have no idea how many times throughout life people have said, so what are you? Right? Because for a lot of people, I'm racially ambiguous. They can't really figure it out. And I know that they want to know, well, I heard you say that you identify as a Black person, but you don't look like other Black people that I've met, or you don't. And they're really trying to figure out, what is your background, right? I had a girl that I worked with, and we were really good friends. We were really good work friends. And I had my hair straightened like this. Normally my hair is curly and it's really big and curly, right? Sometimes I get it straightened. And she tapped me on my shoulder and she goes, well, Adria, like, you're not like Black, are you? And I said, well, Caitlin, why do you think that? And she said, because your hair, it's like silky. It's really silky. And she said, it's not what I've seen that other Black people have that kind of hair. And so we had a whole conversation. Was it a microaggression? Yes. What do I know that she absolutely was just trying to figure it out? Yes, right? So because she was my friend, I took the time to say, hey, our community, we had come in all colors, all shapes, hair textures. There's a lot of differences, right? So absolutely an educated moment for her. Our friend here in the middle, oh, I wouldn't have expected you to be a science major, right? That we know statistically there aren't a lot of women that are in the STEM field, right? But that is a microaggression. And then here on the side, no, where are you really from, right? And some people are like, well, I don't understand that one, or I don't know how I should ask that question. And the reason why this is a microaggression is because if this person were sitting in your classroom, we're going to say we'll say she's in my hometown, Kentucky. And when someone say, hey girl, where are you from? And she's like, Kentucky. And they're like, no, where are you like from? And she's like, Kentucky. And they're like, where are you from? Like, from. And she's like, I was born and raised in Kentucky. And what they're trying to figure out is her background, right? Or maybe if she is an immigrant, or maybe if her parents are immigrants, or what country her heritage stems from, right? All well-meaning information and wanting to know, just getting to know her, but implying that she cannot be from Kentucky, or not taking Kentucky as an answer can be microaggressive. And the better way to ask someone that is to say, hey, where do you call home, right? And where is home for you? And if the person says Kentucky, well, by gosh, they're from Kentucky, right? We have a tendency as humans to want to kind of place people in a box. We ask all these identifiers because we just want to know. We just have to know where to place them. And I want to challenge you all to get out of having to place people in these boxes, or what we have been conditioned to think the boxes that people should naturally fit in. Right? Are you all still with me? You still here in the chat? Okay. So let's go over, well, what are people thinking then, right? So one microaggression is you speak really good English, right? And then you're saying like, yeah, you're articulate. But the theme of that is saying you're kind of a foreign or an alien, right? In your own land, somewhere that you probably were born. Or in the message that it communicates to the person is you aren't American, or we can tell you're not from here. Um, Another microaggression, when I look at you, I don't see color. I hear people say this all the time because it's a way to say, like, oh, I'm not racist, or nothing about me is racist. I don't even see color. But what it does is it denies the person's actual racial and ethnic experience, right? Because for a lot of people of color, they want you to see them, right? They're proud to be a person of color. They're proud to be a part of their community. And to say you don't see color means you don't see a whole piece of who they are, right? So for some people, that microaggression is saying, you know, I don't even see it. I don't even notice it because I don't want to be labeled a racist. But in return, you're actually saying that you don't see a very big part of the person you're communicating with, right? Another one is this, and these are all race, these ones are race-based. We'll get into some other examples in a second. Or someone saying, oh, no, I would never do that because my best friend is Black, or my best friend is Asian, or my best friend is Latina, right? But that's also the denial of individual racism. It's saying, I'm immune. There's no way that I could be racist or discriminatory because I have friends of color, right? And that is not true, right? And it's also a microaggression. And then another one, you are so articulate, right? And that's an description of intelligence, but it's also saying it's unusual for someone of your race or your background to be intelligent. And so I feel like I have to tell you that you're so articulate, or that you speak good English, right? Or that you're so smart, and say it as if, I'm surprised you're so smart, right? And so thinking about how sometimes we may just say these things without even recognizing the message that it's conveying to other people. One for gender, right? Sometimes we hear, and again, these are microaggressions all based on those marginalized identities, right? So for women, smile, you're too pretty for people not to see your smile, right? Or a female engineering student, and that was the message, that the example that I used earlier, continuously receives emails addressed as sir, because it's unlikely for someone of your gender to pursue that degree. Or so for sexual orientation, I like you, but why do other people have to shove it in our faces, right? So I'm comfortable with you as a member of the LGBTQ community because you're not like other LGBT people, because why do they have to make us feel so uncomfortable, right? And what that says, oh, I'm sorry, that's not supposed to, I don't know, I didn't copy over the correct term, but right there it's saying that I'm okay with you, but I'm not okay with everyone else, right? And where this is communicating is, so are you really okay with my sexual identity then? Because what makes everyone else so different, right? Another one for sexual orientation is, so which role do you play in the relationship, right? It implies that a normal relationship must have distinct gender roles, right? It's a very heteronormative way to think about a same-sex relationship, right? And one for disability, and I know, or people with disabilities, I know sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as well, I may see someone with a disability and my first response is wanting to help that person, whether it be getting through the door, opening a door, or picking up something that they may have dropped. And the correct way is actually to ask the person, hey, do you need help, right? Rather than jumping right in with their savior complex and wanting to help, because it sends a message that that person can't function independently, right?
Adria, we're at the 5-minute mark here to our Q&A.
Okay, cool. Well, let me keep going. And so also religion. Well, you don't look Jewish, right? It sends a message that all Jewish people are supposed to look alike. Another one, although it not explicitly celebrated, a public school's displays Christmas decorations in December. In America, Christianity is the most important religion, and those who practice are outsiders, right? This one is also really important for me, the class one. You hear people say it all the time, oh my gosh, that's so ghetto, right? And if you're a person like me, I grew up a very low socioeconomic status, and when you have lived in what people actually call ghettos, real ghettos, and then you hear someone who may be of privilege saying that that's so ghetto, it's kind of a hurt, because it's like that person has probably never actually experienced what it feels like to have been born into an actual impoverished area, right? And so it sends a message that low socioeconomic status is associated with negative or undesirable characteristics, right? So after we experience microaggressions, a lot of times we try to make meaning of it. So am I being too sensitive? Am I attacking someone? If I don't say something, will it happen again? And then it's the activation of the stereotype. Is what they said actually true, right? Is what they said true about me? And that's where we get to the pile-on principle. So I want you all to listen very clearly, because sometimes, especially in the age of social media, we see these people that things have happened to them and they lose it, right? And as the person who's receiving, we're just thinking like, they could have handled that so differently, or they could have taken a moment to educate that person, or they could have taken a moment to just take a breath and it wasn't that serious, right? And I want you all to know that people with marginalized identities, especially, think about having 4 or 5 identities on that right side of that list that we were talking about. Think about if you're a person who's moving through life as a person of color who may be LGBT, who's also low socioeconomic status, maybe non-Christian. Think about all of the types of discrimination that you may experience on a daily basis, right? And then think about microaggressions, again, those very subtle slights that that person may experience. So the pylon principle is like a person, I go to work, and when I'm getting out of bed, I accidentally hit my toe on the bed, right? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, that really hurt, but whatever, let me shake it off. So then I go and I get in my car, and as I'm trying to like close my car door, or my husband comes by and he's closing my car door, he doesn't realize my foot is still halfway out the car. So boom, that same toe gets hit again. So now I'm like, ooh, my toe really, really hurts, but okay, I'm still gonna shake it off. And I finally walk into my building and I see my favorite coworker, and he accidentally bumps into me and spills his coffee on my same foot, on my same toe. So by this time, I'm like, do you not see my foot? My foot is here. What? Everyone's avoiding the toe. And he's like, I'm sorry, Adria, it was an accident. I just accidentally bumped into you with my coffee, right? But what he didn't know was all the other times before that, that same foot was injured, or that same toe got injured in that same day, right? And so when you think about microaggressions that people may experience on a daily basis, or how people may move throughout life experiencing these instances over and over and over, I want you all to go back, not only to think about this pylon principle, but think about that iceberg too, right? Think about how you can start to build relationships, deeper relationships with people that will allow you to know them a little better, to be more familiar with their identities, so that you're not unintentionally committing some of these microaggressions, and what it means to hold some of these identities as they navigate through life. Mike, where am I? I probably have like 1 minute.
We're at the 6:45 mark. So
okay.
If you want to go ahead and take some questions from the group, that would be
okay. Cool. I hope someone asks me, well, what do I do if or what's next, because then I can give you my next slide. So ask away, ask me questions, and don't feel pressured. Anything you all want to ask. Okay, Lindsay, great. What's next? Perfect. So I do just want to give you this really quickly. If you are a person who is an ally, Or if you are trying to respond to a microaggression, I want you to remember this: breathe, acknowledge, respond. It's called BAR, right? And it comes from Maura Collins' book, 35 Things Well-Intended People Say. But it sounds so stupid, like, okay, Adria, breathe, acknowledge, respond. Like, I could have came up with that, right? But it's really coming up with those responses, or being able to step in for another person who has just had a microaggression committed to them, and maybe you picked up on it, and it's being able to step in for that person and educate the person who committed the microaggression. And so what does that look like, right? It looks like during practice, you hear a peer say, "Oh my gosh, you're a lifesaver. I love you. No homo," right? Because I worked on a college campus and I heard that all the time. I heard people say it. And so you take a breath and you acknowledge the person. And when you acknowledge them, you call them into a conversation. "Hey, I realize no homo is often used in a joking manner to mean you don't have romantic or sexual feelings for the other person. However, you may be sending the message that you aren't accepting of the LGBTQ community, which may prevent future LGBTQ athletes from feeling comfortable at practice," right? And this is an example based on sexuality, but I want you to think about maybe things you hear about race. Think about things you hear about different genders or religions, and how can you, as an ally and someone who says, "I'm going to stand up for people with marginalized identities," how can you step in to think about some of these responses, right? And that acknowledge part, to not call people out and say, "I can't believe you said that. That was so wrong. Are you dumb?" Right? Because people shut down automatically. But when you can call them into a conversation, you have time to acknowledge, "Hey, I know you probably didn't mean to say that, but this is what the message said." Right? So that's what's next, Lindsay. Thank you for asking. What else? Any other questions?
Now, as we're waiting for questions to come in, I was just thinking about something that I heard on the radio a couple of years ago. A former player for the Green Bay Packers, his name is Anthony Herron. He's now on the radio here in the Chicago area, but he talked about how people would just randomly ask him on the streets of Green Bay, "Hey, what position do you play?" And he's like, "Well, how do you know I play for the Packers?" Because
Yeah.
I'm the only black guy, big black guy you see walking around town here.
Yep, absolutely. And for some people, it may be like, I'm pretty sure they're complimenting him or wanting to know, right? But it's also like, can I be anything other than an athlete, right?
Yep. We do have a question here.
Yep. How would you deal with microaggressions when hearing it from strangers? Yeah, Beth. I mean, honestly, your comfortability in, again, using BAR and acknowledging what someone said, that's really up to you, right? I would say first, always analyze the situation. Like, is it a hostile situation? Would it be safe for you to step in and get involved? That's always my kind of first line, where I draw the line is, would it be safe? Or does it seem like a situation where you could step in and say, "Hey, really quickly, I want to tell you, I heard what you said back there, and I know you didn't intend it that way, but this is how it could come off," right? So whether it be a stranger or whether it be someone, and actually sometimes, Beth, it's a little easier, in my opinion, sometimes to have the conversations with strangers, because I've noticed when my family commits microaggressions, and trying to educate your family can be a little bit tougher, right? Because they're people you're extremely close with, right? So those awkward Thanksgiving dinners that turn into like these debates, and you hear people saying some wild things, can be a little bit tougher actually to navigate. Oh gosh, we have a lot rolling in here. Okay, hold on a second. So let's see. I like to compliment people, and sometimes I see a woman of color and want to compliment her hair but don't know how. And I have had coworkers that also have said this to me, like, "Adria, I switch up my hair a lot. Sometimes I have weaves, down to my butt. Sometimes I have braids. Sometimes I have my real hair straightened. Sometimes it's curly. So hair is a thing. And I don't think that complimenting someone on their hair is a microaggression, right? I think that if you ask to touch someone's hair, or I've gotten responses like, "Oh, Adria, your hair is braided today. I didn't even think that was you." And it's like, really, who else would be sitting in my cubicle? Who would I be? That's a little bit more microaggressive behavior. I think that if you compliment a woman's hair and say, I love how you're able to switch up your style. Like, I love it. And maybe I wish I could do that with my hair. Like, it looks great on you. And just keep it moving. But also make sure it's kind of like we have to compliment not everyone, but make sure you're not only complimenting women of color, right? So if you see a person who is a white person come in and maybe you notice they have a fresh blowout or some new color or a new cut, maybe compliment that person as well, right? So kind of the balance would be the way to keep it non-microaggressive. How do you think a team should approach talking more about microaggressions? Can it ever be talked about too much? No. Is it a topic that can be talked about once a week? I think absolutely, right? I think that sometimes, and you'll be surprised when you bring up the topic of microaggressions, that students and college athletes and on college campuses, these things happen a lot. You'll be surprised at how many students, once the dialogue gets started, have said, "Hey, I've experienced that." And if they are very comfortable saying, "Hey, I may have even accidentally committed a microaggression a couple times," right? I don't think that it's anything that can be talked about too much. In fact, I think the more that we start having these conversations, the more comfortable people are expressing their run-ins with microaggressions or committing microaggressions, and being more knowledgeable about how we can be a little bit more inclusive. The more we become aware of these types of things, the more inclusive our campuses become overall. I would also say, just a little bit of advice, maybe try to build it up, right? So just how I talked to you all about social identities first, and then we started talking a little bit about how our brains are wired to automatically think in a certain way, so that everyone knows, hey, we're all subject to commit a microaggression, or we all or some of us can be in a position to have a microaggression committed to us as well. There can be multiple layers of this conversation, right? So it doesn't have to always happen in the same exact way.
So I'm seeing plenty of questions from coaches. I'd like to hear some from the student athletes that are on the chat. So while we're waiting for participation from student athletes, I just had a follow-up to Tethany's question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you start that conversation with the team? I know it in a team dynamic, it can be awkward at times.
Yeah.
How do you get that conversation going?
So my suggestion first, for me, microaggressions is more of like a level 2, level 3 conversation. If you all have not started having basic conversations about just identities, like, who are you? Like, having your student athletes say, that I'll use me as an example. I am a Black female from Kentucky that was a first generation college student that came from a low income background, that is a Christian. That having your students start there to think about themselves in that iceberg, because what that is gonna do is it's going to not only get them to think about how they show up in certain places, right? But it gets them to think about how the world sees them, how the lens in which they see other people, right? How we even interact with other people a lot of times is through our own cultural lens and through our own experiences. Sometimes we, for instance, you can see a young Black man running down the street, and you can see a older white man running down the street. They may be doing the same thing, but you may be having a total different message, right? And that's because based on your social identities, your cultural lens is different. right? So I would start there in saying, let's talk about who we are and how does this show up? And what are some of our like privileges based on our identities, right? And then build from there into these types of conversations, right? Because without, second piece to that question, do some team building around D&I, right? And these are, Mike, I can work with you also on the side, give you some suggestions of activities that can be done. But the more the athletes start having these conversations in groups, they become comfortable talking about these things. So then when microaggressions is thrown out there, it's not like, oh my God. It's already, we've been having these conversations and we feel comfortable. The third piece is, when things like this happen on campus, they will feel comfortable coming to administration and coming to coaches because you all have already facilitated this kind of conversation, right? Or they know it's not a sticky situation. All right. I see. How would you address a microaggression in a situation that's not necessarily safe for you to say something, a student athlete? Yeah, so if it's student athlete to student athlete, and someone is witnessing it and says, hey, I don't feel safe stepping in between two students, I would go to a coach or I would report it. Maybe stepping in isn't the thing, or I would wait until after the situation is done, right? Maybe wait a day, maybe wait 2 days, and you see the person again, you say, hey, I want to talk to you about something, right? Maybe you don't step in right at that time when you hear it. Maybe you say, I'm going to let that slide and I'm going to circle back, but I know that I'm going to have a conversation with that person at some time. But I also think that that's why it's important that the coaches are having these conversations, Lindsay, because if you do see something and you say, hey, I'm not comfortable stepping in, but I need to be able to report this to someone, the person you report it to has to also be able to take this kind of stuff seriously as well. They have to be able to say, hey, this is a challenge and this is a problem, in order to address it as well. I hope that's answering your question. Let me know if it's not.
We do have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Any student athletes? We got shy student athletes tonight. These are all questions from coaches.
Don't be shy, you all. I remember when I was a college student, right? Don't be shy. I wish I was still in college. Okay, cool. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I'll just leave you with some takeaways, right? Recognize that dismissive attitudes are harmful. Engage in self-reflection to identify times you may have been microaggressive in your personal life. Participate in some ongoing education on the topic. There's tons of information about microaggressions. I would really encourage all of you all to look up Daryl Wing Sue. He is the expert on microaggressions. So much literature out there, even videos and talks from him. He's great. And then avoid making assumptions and labeling individuals, right? And then I'm sure there's plenty more, but I'm going to skip to thank you so much. And here's my contact information. Please feel free, if you did have any questions and you weren't able to, or you didn't feel comfortable putting them in the chat, send me an email. I am open to having these conversations or just talking through some things. But thank you all so much for your time. I hope you learned something and took something away from this presentation. Mike, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Adria. I really appreciate your time this evening in educating us on the topic of microaggressions. Yes, we'd be happy to connect later and get some more information about exercises that our teams could do, and I'd be more than happy to pass that along.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you again to Adria. Thank you to Elmhurst University for hosting this on Zoom, and thank you to all of our visitors to this presentation tonight. We really appreciate your time and wish everyone that's on here the best of luck the rest of the season. And Adria, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You all have a great day.